everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Something a little bit different today, as I've abandoned the desk in order to speed up this video making process, but don't worry, it will be back very soon. But yes, today's video is more of a walk and talk as I take you through my local park, and I'll be discussing or talking about a question that many people recently, both Taiwanese and other Westerners, have been asking me about my home country. Many people have been asking me, what the hell is this Brexit thing? And more importantly, do I care about it at all? Now, yes, I know that this channel is Life in Taiwan, and it's all about me sharing my life in Taiwan with anyone that cares to watch. And the topic of Brexit over in Europe may seem about as far removed from Taiwan as you could imagine, but as a Brit who's lived here for the past 10-11 years, I see it as my duty to report the goings-on of my country with the people around the world, and here in Taiwan, anybody that wants to watch. Therefore, we're going to be talking about Brexit today. So let's take a look at the basics, the very basics, the etymology or the history of the word Brexit. And it's actually a portmanteau word, meaning the combining of two words, which are Britain and exit. A very poorly worded way of referring to this whole situation, because it's not just Britain that's involved. Britain is the three countries of Scotland, England and Wales, and the UK is actually including Northern Ireland. So, to give it its full name, that's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But yes, Brexit is the topic, talking about how we're planning to leave the European Union. So that's the origins of the word Brexit, but what exactly is it, and why has the subject been raised at all recently? Well, ever since the UK joined the European Union, the EU, in 1972, there's always been somewhat of a debate as to whether or not it's actually a good thing for the country. And just 3 years after joining, in 1975, we actually held our first referendum or vote by the people as to whether or not we would choose to stay in the EU. Now, that vote was actually won by the Remain in the EU voters, and they won by a majority of something like 67% to 33%. But as I mentioned earlier, ever since then, there's always been this debate, this ongoing discussion as to whether or not it's beneficial to our country to stay in the EU. Now, again, just to give you a little bit more basic information about the EU, this European Union, it doesn't actually include all of the countries in Europe, and by voting to leave the European Union, it doesn't mean that geographically the UK will no longer be in Europe. That may seem obvious, but some of my American friends have actually asked me this question, albeit somewhat inebriated at the time. But yes, anyway, as I said, all 50 European countries are not actually part of the EU, and the EU is actually only made up of 28 member countries. Some of the bigger European countries that you may know that are not part of the EU are Russia, Turkey, Norway, Iceland, and each of these countries have their own reasons for either choosing not to be in the EU or maybe for not being allowed to be in the EU. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about why back in 2016, 52% of the UK voting population decided to join them and become no longer a part of the EU. Well, if you want the raw economic data and all of the facts and the figures in a balanced, unbiased opinion, then maybe another source would be better for you. because in my humble but honest opinion, leaving the EU is an absolutely terrible idea for the UK. I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole because it can get very complicated, but around about the time leading up to the referendum, the first half of 2016, the media, the news was absolutely full of anti-Europe propaganda. Yes, admittedly, there was arguing on both sides, but one of the big things that I feel misled the public, which is quite interesting, is that the Leave campaign, the team that wanted to leave Europe, they had this big red London bus, and plastered along the side of it had this big slogan saying how we send £350 million to the EU every week. Let's spend it on the NHS instead. £350 million does sound like a lot of money to the average voter on the street, and I feel they were kind of tricked into believing that by leaving Europe, our NHS, our healthcare system, would receive this injection of cash, which of course is just never going to be so simple. The national health system of the UK is something that we are very proud of, and by using this example to kind of trick the voters into thinking it would get this injection of cash into the healthcare system, I feel was a little underhanded and typical of the Leave campaigners' tactics. Not to mention the fact that it was later discovered that this £350 million figure was completely false, and the membership fee of the EU was much less than that per week, and even if it was, the economic benefits of being in the EU actually far outweigh this membership fee anyway. It was just one of the pretty low tactics used by the Leave campaign to convince voters into voting to leave the European Union. Now, talking of using influence and underhanded, low tactics in order to persuade people to vote for the Leave campaign, the newspapers, especially the tabloid press in the UK, have a lot to answer for. And they were largely responsible for feeding this frenzy created by the Leave Europe group. And as well as that £350 million bus slogan or advert, just so happened that 2015, 2016, there was a huge migrant crisis in Europe. This crisis saw hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of refugees fleeing their homes and countries in Africa or the Middle East because of war, famine, or other such atrocities, and entering Europe illegally, usually by boat into Italy or Greece or Spain, but then, because of the EU and the lax border control, they could easily find their way up through Europe into countries like Germany, France, and indeed the UK. And to be honest, a lot of people in the UK are strongly against having people entering the country illegally. Again, probably fed by the tabloid media that anyone entering the country illegally is of course a terrorist, a job thief, or wants to take advantage of our healthcare or benefit system. It was something that the public in England bought hook, line, and sinker. And because of all this frenzy of propaganda, a lot of people in the UK were led to believe that we were spending too much money being a member of Europe, which was only giving us a negative side effect of having all of these illegal immigrants coming in. A very narrow-minded way to look at it, but as I mentioned, the public were sold this by the media and they bought it. But anyway, yes, that's Brexit, or at least the very basics of it, and my opinion on why I feel it's stupid. But where are we now? 3 years after the vote took place, is the UK in better condition? No, not at all. And in fact, until March 29th this year, we are still actually in the EU. And at the moment, as of the making of this video, there has been no economic or trade deals, an absolutely terrible situation to be in. In fact, our Prime Minister, Theresa May, recently drew up a proposal deal that needed to be approved by her own MPs and that of the opposing party, and they overwhelmingly voted against that deal. What she had in mind didn't match with what they wanted for the country, so we are basically up creek without a paddle, as my mum would say. One thing I do know about the Brexit deal is that just like any separation or any divorce, there needs to be some kind of payment or settlement, which is actually going to cost the UK economy £39 billion, way more than that 350 million a week that the people, when they voted for it, had no idea about. Nobody told them, but yes, 39 billion just to be released from the EU and then go on our own way, trying to make a success of ourselves as a fully independent, non-tied to Europe country. And there are lots of other questions that people don't know the answers to. What will happen to UK citizens currently living in EU countries? We don't know. Will all European people that are currently settled in the UK have to leave? We don't know. Will we now need to build a physical border between Northern Ireland of the UK and the Republic of Ireland? We don't know. All we do know is that come March 29th, 2019, the UK will be leaving the EU with no economic trade deals in place. Unless, of course, the Prime Minister embarrassingly decides to halt the process, stay in the EU a little longer, and keep us all in limbo. Anyway, that's pretty much everything that I know about it. Hopefully I've answered a few of the questions people in Taiwan might have had about this ridiculous situation going on in the UK. But if there's anything that you know that I don't, then feel free to add it to the comments section. If you have any more questions about Brexit, or in fact anything about the UK, then drop a line down below and I'll get back to you. If this is your first time to my channel and you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell and share. It really helps the channel out. But as for now, just want to say thanks for watching. Thanks to all of my patrons over on Patreon for your unending support. It's much appreciated. And as always, I'll see you next time in My Life in Taiwan. Peace.